episode is called Case Studies and Best Practices of Broadband and Public-Private Partnerships. I'm Sebastian Smelko, and I'll be serving as your moderator for this section, and I'll be joined by two of my colleagues, Lindsay Miller and Matt Miller. Lindsay Miller is an attorney at Ice Miller. She has over a decade of experience in technological initiatives and has built a strong reputation in the broadband and telecommunications arena. Lindsay regularly advises municipalities on how to utilize P3s for fiber and Wi-Fi expansions in order to build smarter cities and leverage the Internet of Things. Matt Miller is a partner in Ice Miller's Municipal Finance Group and has extensive experience advising governmental entities on infrastructure and economic development projects utilizing various modes of project delivery, including P3s. Matt served as counsel on over 100 project financing and has particular expertise in public transportation and airport-related financing. The municipalities increasingly find themselves trying to balance and streamline their costs for utilities, water, and wastewater management services, while simultaneously trying to improve these services. How can public-private partnerships help them in this matter?
Do you want me to start?
Go ahead.
Sebastian, I don't know if we could have made you say Miller anymore in that introduction. Lindsay Miller, Matt Miller, and Ice Miller. So the situation that we're in now is that, as we all know, critical infrastructure across the country is aging. We hear about it on the news, we hear about it in our communities, and this infrastructure traditionally is going to be roads, bridges, the types of infrastructure that has facilitated the movement of utilities as we've known them to date. So in urban areas, what this looks like oftentimes is that populations are growing, and as a result, infrastructure is stressed from use. In more of our rural markets, populations may be declining, and as a result, those pieces of infrastructure can fall into states of disrepair. But regardless of the location, community budgets are often strapped, and it's very difficult to address this aging infrastructure. On top of that, we are in a position where there are uncertain federal incentives and oftentimes unclear state incentives for this type of infrastructure. And so we have created a moment in time, which has been developing for a while, in which we are seeing a bigger demand for innovative funding solutions. And that's where public-private partnerships can play a key role. And in a public-private partnership, or I'm going to say P3 a lot just because it's a lot easier than saying public-private partnership over and over, working with the private sector can become itself one of the community assets. So the participation of the private entity can also supplement what's going on locally. As a result, the community can gain access, for example, to cutting-edge technologies that it may otherwise not be able to afford, may not have the capacity or skill set to know how to use, or have access to just simply because of its setup as a municipality or community area. And as a result of working with the public sector and the private sector together, the public sector can leverage the private sector's expertise and resources in order to free up their own budgets to focus on either other initiatives or other P3s or other infrastructure programs. And it takes some of that financial burden off of them in order to address these infrastructure challenges.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. From a public sector perspective, when the private sector gets involved, it takes a lot of the day-to-day maintenance operation away from the public sector. So choices that are typically budgetary considerations or political considerations, they shift over to contract situations. So you're contracting with a private entity in order to perform these services. So when something goes wrong, whether there's a maintenance issue, whether there's a service issue, you're calling on a contract provision versus going to city council and trying to get a new contractor or trying to dissolve a contract. So it makes the administration a lot easier. And these contracts typically last 30 to 40 years, so there's some continuity and some certainty there. With respect to just the process of entering into these P3s, it is a lot of planning that's involved, but the process, once you get the right people at the table, is a very streamlined process. There's answers contractually to every question that arises throughout the course of a concessionaire contract. The financing costs are a little bit more when you on the outset, so there is going to be a kind of a sticker shock at the beginning. But if you think of the amount that you save in deferred maintenance over the course of a contract, it definitely makes up for it over time. I mean, if we're thinking just an infrastructure project, you're getting back a project in 30 years in the same condition you would be getting it back now. If you look at a government-run facility or government-run infrastructure now and look at it 30 years from now, you look at some of the 30-year-old projects now, and they're in a pretty good state of disrepair. So you eliminate a lot of those issues there when the contract ends.
Matt, these are clearly very complex arrangements and partnerships between the public sector and the private sector. Would you or Lindsay like to comment on some of the steps that you would likely advise municipalities to take or think about when they're approaching public-private partnerships?
Yeah, I think the first step to take is identify a clear goal. Have a clear goal and a clear outcome, and that'll help you kind of formulate your team and formulate a plan, because during this process, planning is the absolute most important thing.
I agree. As a first step, I think there are a different set of goals to look at, though. So there's the immediate needs. What do we need to do today or within the next year? And then what are our future plans? What are our long-term goals? And when it comes to broadband and a public-private partnership, we often encourage that long-term plan should be the ultimate betterment of the community through connectivity, whether that's through economic development, which I know is touched on in another webinar series or video series, whether that is providing additional residential and commercial access, but the long-term goals of the community, especially as we look at a broadband P3, are going to be important. So in some cases, those goals may be overhauling existing infrastructure. It may be innovating and creating new infrastructure, or it may be looking at a very specific problem that we're trying to solve, such as utility monitoring or something like that that's going to be reliant on connectivity.
What do you see as some of the biggest hurdles that municipalities or entities would confront during a public-private partnership?
So it's interesting. I had a conversation with someone recently, and I asked them what they thought the biggest hurdle to P3s was from their perspective. And they said politics. And really what that comes down to is getting the buy-in from all of those that are going to be involved. And when we look at the steps that a community can take, if they're first going to define the problem, they next need to look at what assets they already have. And then, as Matt mentioned, get the right folks to the table, get stakeholder buy-in. And the folks at the table are going to need to be more than just the community members itself. It needs to be some of the potential private partners. It may need to be some industry experts or advisors who can provide guidance throughout the process. So I think getting that buy-in consistently and maintaining it throughout the process, because oftentimes the contracting of this can take a while and can be quite dense. Getting that throughout the process is going to be important. Ultimately, though, from my perspective, what a public-private partnership comes down to, whether it's for broadband or another form of infrastructure, is a balance of risk and control between the public and the private sector parties. And so as the entities are figuring out what this arrangement is going to look like, maintaining and managing that risk in control and what each one can temper is going to be important in order to make sure that the P3 functions in the long term. Do you agree?
I agree wholeheartedly. Right. I think resources are so limited. I think something to keep in mind from the public sector perspective is your internal resources are very, very limited. And it's even with respect to human capital, just to make sure that the dedicated resources are applied to these projects, because they are complicated. There's a lot of planning involved. So the more people you can get on board and buy in internally from the beginning, the better off and the more successful the P3 will be at the end.
Can either of you think of a particular case study or example that highlight sort of a successful broadband public-private partnership?
Project that was done in the city of Dublin, Ohio, which essentially is an effort between public and private sector entities for a fiber ring that was started many years ago, and it has been very successful and has brought a lot of economic development opportunities to that community. And then somewhat related in that the city of Dublin, Ohio is involved in both is the US 33 corridor project, which is the US 33 corridor running through Ohio from the city of Dublin to the city of Marysville. That is a project for connected and autonomous vehicle testing, and in order to test those types of vehicles, there's going to be a broadband component. So there's fiber involved, there's wireless infrastructure involved, and then there are arrangements between both the public sector entities, including the cities, the counties, as well as the Ohio Department of Transportation, and then private sector folks such as Honda. Michael Baker International is involved. They're an engineering firm. So those are a few that we've seen, for example, in Ohio. One of the largest P3s that we've seen in the United States for broadband specifically is going to be the Kentucky Wired project in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And certainly that project has faced its challenges. That has been very publicly talked about. But the project is moving forward, and once complete, it will be really the largest P3 of its kind focused on broadband, as it will be getting fiber infrastructure to all 120 counties of that state. And we really haven't seen a P3 for broadband of that magnitude.
Yeah, the Kentucky Wired project's a very good case study for what to do on the right side of things and when things can kind of fall apart a little bit. And I know Lindsay has a lot of good experience with, unwinding some of the bad things and kind of getting it back on track.
Speaking sort of about portions of Kentucky which are primarily rural areas, there are a lot of rural areas throughout the entire country, frankly. How can the private sector work with those local governmental entities or even the state governmental entities to help serve some of those underutilized, or not underutilized, underserved populations, whether it be within an urban core or within more rural areas throughout the country?
I think it starts with the will of the local communities to want to work with some of the larger telecom companies, or to provide their own, or come up with some sort of partnership between the two. I think it kind of starts there. I think there's some will on both sides, but and underserved communities can also provide some sort of social and philanthropic avenue for investment of dollars. There's been a big push recently over the past several years for environmental and social impact kind of projects. And, when you see underserved areas that are not getting access to proper health care and telemedicine, and some of the educational disparities that a connected rural community can have if there's some sort of public-private partnership or some sort of coordinated effort amongst, local communities to kind of remedy that, I think there's a huge opportunity there with the direction folks are spending their money on nowadays.
I definitely agree. I think when we talk about un- and underserved communities, we've really reached the tipping point in broadband build-out, in which if a provider, especially of a certain size, intended to build out to that area because there was the return on investment to do so, they likely would have already done it. So those areas that remain unserved or underserved, depending on how you look at it, are oftentimes because it's either going to be too expensive as it stands right now, or there isn't sufficient density there of subscribers. So even if they built out, there wouldn't be enough people to sign up to curb the costs. So the way that a community can work with private entities to get build out there is either to find ways to incentivize the build out and address costs that way, or to reduce the cost of build out. And so, for example, one opportunity that we see is what we call dig once initiatives, where if the community is going to be working on another infrastructure project, they analyze whether or not there can be a broadband component. So for example, if they are ripping up a road or sidewalks, or in a more recent example that we've all spoken about before this video, a sewer project, is there an opportunity to install conduit and or fiber, or maybe another form of broadband connectivity in order to get it to the community, but in a more cost-effective way? And that can be very appealing to a private provider, because it shows that they do not have to pay for all the upfront construction costs, which can be the most cost prohibitive part of getting broadband to a community, especially if it's rural, especially if it has topography challenges. I'm sure some folks live in very mountainous areas, or those with a lot of hills or valleys. I'm in Columbus, Ohio, which is extremely flat. So there are different challenges depending on your geography.
Yeah. I think keeping the barriers for companies coming in and wanting to do this, I think that's absolutely, keeping those very, very low. Because at the end of the day, it is dollars and cents with a lot of this. And finding and utilizing and leveraging your municipal services as an anchor tenant, or thinking of creative ways for the municipality or the county or whatever it may be with the local communities to leverage what they have to attract other businesses or broadband companies to the table.
Matt, you mentioned something a little earlier related to sort of social impact. And when I think of broadband expansion, I think of it's almost a way to provide equitable and equity to the masses of individuals. These days, people, I think, will come to expect internet providers or internet service within their areas. Speaking specifically, though, on how we structure these P3s with broadband expansion, we need to, I would imagine that public entities would want to also focus on equity and equitable treatment, particularly as it relates to race. How can public entities who are faced with analyzing to P3 or to not P3, how can they ensure that these aspects of a particular project, maybe they could be segmented out, maybe they can provide additional outreach to minority or women-owned business enterprises? Could you just talk about that balance a little bit?
Sure, there's definitely a balance there, and I think you kind of just to back up a little bit. I mean, a lot of these issues aren't solely related to P3s, right? At these larger scale projects, there's always some sort of inequity there when it comes to participation with women and minority-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses. So I think if you look at it holistically, and I guess, there's going to be certain public sector entities that already have DBE programs in place. When they're receiving federal funding and grants and that kind of thing, they're already going to have these programs in place. If you're not subject to or do not have a DBE policy already in place, it might be a good idea to start considering one as a holistic approach, not just for a particular P3 project, but for holistically. And when doing that, you definitely want to consult your local and state and federal rules when drafting these policies, because there are some restrictions and requirements that are in place to narrowly tailor these policies. But get the right consultants on board. Really encourage, and I think this is a process with P3s in general, is be as transparent as possible when you're doing these projects, because there's so many people that are involved that want to be involved in these projects. And the minute that you kind of shut the door and shut people out, and that's when these P3 projects started getting bad press, and some of the stakeholders might pull back. So I think it's part of a holistic approach to it, and being more inclusive and more transparent from the beginning.
Lindsay, do you think that delivery model matters from a broadband expansion perspective? What sort of analysis would you imagine that public entities should take when considering a broadband?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, in a typical lawyer answer, it depends. It is largely going to be influenced by where the project is, what existing infrastructure is already available, and by that I mean existing private networks, existing public networks, and existing pieces of infrastructure that can be used to facilitate a network. So for example, are there high rooftops or other pieces of high structure that can be used for the line of sight that's needed in wireless connectivity? So point A has to be able to essentially see point B, and the signal can travel. On the same side, what pieces of infrastructure are available, such as poles, such as rights-of-way? What about permitting processes? So in terms of what broadband would be best for a community, certainly we're hearing fiber all the time now. It's definitely a buzzword. And the reason that folks want fiber or think they want fiber is because fiber is essentially future-proof. So the way it works is it's basically very, very small glass tubes, and it transmits light to send signals. And once it's in the ground or strung on the poles, it really doesn't have to be touched again unless something goes wrong and it's cut. But in order to send stronger signals, you just have to upgrade the technology that's on either end of it. So the part that's sending it or the part that's receiving it. Whereas technology in the past that was wired, as it got older, and for example, maybe it was a copper line, you would have to dig it back up. And that's very cost prohibitive. So we're hearing a lot about fiber for that reason, because once it's there, hopefully it can weather the storm and be there for a long time. Also, fiber is going to be the foundation for a lot of the wireless infrastructure that we talk about today. So when we hear about 5G, which is usually dependent on small cell infrastructure, which is essentially poles that transmit wireless signals, those have to connect back into fiber as well. Pretty much all wireless networks do at some point within the network. And so fiber is something that folks are really pushing for. That all being said, just as public-private partnerships are not one size fits all, and it may not be the right solution for every project, fiber might not be the solution right now for a community for a variety of reasons. And there are a lot of other mediums out there that can provide strong connectivity. We've seen a lot of advancements in the fixed wireless space. So when I say fixed wireless, I mean two essentially immobile points, whereas mobile wireless is what we know of as our cell phones. We also still have cable out there, and sometimes there is DSL lines where we may struggle to get the speeds of the future that we need with some of that infrastructure, but it is still there as an option to supplement. Certainly mobile networks can help, and then in some areas satellite is going to be the best option because usually of geographic challenges. And we're seeing a lot of advancements in satellite technology and more low orbit satellites, which can address some of the essentially signal traveling issues that we've seen historically. So the answer really is it depends, but I think what's important for a community to analyze when trying to figure out what piece of broadband will be best for them goes back to the best practices and steps that Matt and I talked about at the outset, which is look at what you're trying to do, look at what you have, and look at what you are trying to do in the future, and really analyze if you can get folks to coalesce around an idea that's going to get you to those goals, and to get, if you're going to work with a private provider, if you can get a private provider that's going to be willing to provide that piece of broadband infrastructure, and fiber right now may not be it.
And thinking towards the future, like you said, making sure the technology you're using now is something that's going to be relevant in a few years. And we had been talking a little bit earlier about, is fiber going to be usable in 10 years? We're thinking about ripping things out and digging once and laying all these fiber lines. Is it going to be an obsolete technology in 10 years? And, it's up in the air, but Lindsay thinks
I would say no, but I'm sure some would probably argue with that. But I think what we will need is more.
Yeah.
And so thinking towards the future, if you're going to install conduit, maybe it doesn't even have the fiber in it, it's the pipe essentially that would surround it. How do you install larger conduit or conduit with subducts, so smaller pieces that you can string more fiber through later? And thinking about all of that now, so maybe the needs of today don't require 188 strands of fiber, but in the future it may, and how can you make sure that you have the space for that?
The capacity.
And the capacity, exactly.
You mentioned earlier, Lindsay, about uncertainty within some states or from the federal government about regulations and how they apply. Speaking on budgetary matters, education, Medicaid, and corrections roughly account for 2/3 of state budgets. While everyone thinks of P3s happening on roads and bridges throughout the country, that takes about 10% on average of state budgets. From either a state or federal revenue streams, is there a way that governments could take advantage and leverage kind of broadband expansion to eat into that 2/3?
Sebastian, thanks for bringing that back up. We do see uncertainty for federal incentives and state incentives. And I think one thing that's important for Matt and I to address in our time here is that one piece that a community will need to look at is the state that it operates in, and whether or not, first of all, there is P3 enabling legislation, or if there are restrictions on public-private partnerships. It's good to know that going into it, so expectations can be realistic in terms of what is going to be feasible and what may not be.
Right.
And certainly there are a lot of opportunities across the country today to inform P3 legislation in those states in which it's needed. But working to get a little bit more of that bucket of money that may be available, there are certainly opportunities to convene and coalesce different types of infrastructure projects with broadband. And we always encourage thinking about it from that perspective. So very recently I was having a community conversation in which they are looking at, similar to the US 33 corridor that I mentioned, essentially a connected and autonomous vehicle testing corridor, which is very innovative, is very forward thinking, and they're struggling to find funding sources. And ultimately that's a transportation project. It's a new form of transportation, but it's transportation. And so we had the conversation of how can we make that from just a transportation project to a transportation and broadband project, and look at expanding the broadband, for example, in the surrounding county or the surrounding communities. And what does that mean in terms of opening up that project then for additional funding sources? So looking at ways to address different buckets of money or tap into different buckets of money by putting together infrastructure. The one good thing about broadband is it can oftentimes be built out with a variety of pieces of infrastructure, and looking for ways to efficiently do that is going to be hugely important in terms of capturing all the funding that is available.
Yeah. I think it's just keeping it on top of mind with infrastructure projects, with larger developments. I mean, broadband can be a component of any of those. And we were talking about social impact before. I mean, broadband and affordable housing could be a very good way to marry two ideas that, folks are trying to solve these problems with financing broadband and providing affordable housing to various communities across the United States. And those two could combine and come up with different avenues for funding sources and bring different private partners to the table and different investors to the table. So just thinking about broadband as a portion of a project, as part of the infrastructure when building various projects, whether they're true infrastructure projects like roads and bridges, social infrastructure projects, such as, buildings and municipal buildings, or residential projects, commercial projects, whatever it may be, broadband does have a component with it. And kind of circle back on kind of making sure when you're looking at a P3 project potentially for broadband, or for any way in that matter, Lindsay hit the nail on the head, just to make sure that the legislation is there. There's a lot of transportation and that type of infrastructure legislation on the books, but there's not a lot of social infrastructure P3 legislation on the books. There's a lot of it that is percolating through various legislatures, but just to make sure that you do have the authority to do this. A lot of times you can probably get the right people in the room and cobble together authority, but just to make sure that you have the right people in the room, so the rug doesn't get pulled out from underneath you once you're halfway down the road.
What's the number one piece of advice that you provide a governmental entity who is considering dipping its toe into the public-private partnership world while expanding broadband in its region?
It's hard to come up with just one piece of advice for this. And honestly, I think Matt and I could talk on this topic for hours on end. And so even wrapping this up in a relatively short period of time is hard. But if I had to give one piece of advice, I would go back to that balance of risk and control. And that is applicable to really all P3s, but especially if folks are considering a broadband P3, because some of the risks may be uncertain right now, because we are talking about some technologies that are still coming. We're planning for some innovations that are not yet here. And so we can't account for maybe all the risks or all the pieces of control that we may want 30 years down the line. As Matt said, these can be very long-term arrangements. So having a clear understanding of how much risk especially the public sector can bear within the P3 is going to be extremely important. And I would just also encourage municipalities to not work in a silo in that analysis. So work across departments, work with other communities, talk to other communities or states who have done these types of arrangements, see what works well, see what does not, and certainly engage trusted advisors when the time comes. But my underlying piece of advice would be really honing in on that balance of risk and control of a P3 project.
I have three of them.
Oh.
Planning, and planning. It's really what it boils down to. I mean, before you even go down this path or even think about going down the path, you definitely want to talk to folks. You definitely want to figure out what your end goals are, what your short-term goals are, what your end goals are, and really understand who you are and what you're looking for before you go down the path, because it is an arduous process. There's a lot of upfront costs. There's a lot of upfront time in the planning process to get where you need to be in the back end. Now, the back end, it's a great P3s that go well. They go very well, and everybody's very happy, and the community gets a benefit. The public sector gets things off their books from a budgetary perspective and from a maintenance perspective. But for all that to happen, you definitely have to have the resources dedicated to plan at the very outset, and that's from internal sources, that's from consultants and professionals that have been down the road before to guide you through the process. P3s can be a wonderful thing, but without planning, they can fail fairly easily.
Thank you for joining us for this episode provided by the law firm of Ice Miller and brought to you by CDFA TV.